Every team has that one person. The manager always turns to them first. Their ideas move through approval faster. When they make a mistake, there's context, there's nuance, there's an explanation ready. When someone else makes the same mistake, it's a performance issue. Most people who work in offices have watched this dynamic play out, and most of them assume the same thing. That person must be doing something exceptional. But here's what the research actually shows. In most cases, they're not the top performer on the team. So what's actually happening? There's a belief that runs through almost every corporate environment. The belief goes, managers evaluate employees based on output. The best results produce the most trust. Merit rises. Organizations are at their core meritocracies. Imperfect ones, sure, but systems where performance is the primary currency. Most employees operate on this assumption. They come in, they do the work, they deliver, and they wait. And then they watch someone else get promoted. The problem with the meritocracy assumption isn't that it's entirely wrong. It's that it leaves out what managers are actually dealing with on a day-to-day basis. A manager at a mid-sized tech company isn't spending their day in careful contemplation of each team member's quarterly contribution. They're in back-to-back meetings. They're fielding escalations. They're managing upward to their own director. They're trying to keep multiple projects from derailing simultaneously. They are operating under constant cognitive load. And when a human brain is under cognitive load, it stops doing careful analysis. It falls back on shortcuts, intuition, pattern recognition, gut feel. Managers don't choose their favorites deliberately. They develop them through hundreds of small, largely unconscious interactions over time. And the employees who end up favored are not the ones who performed best. They're the ones who made those interactions feel easiest. Here's the first thing most people miss about manager favoritism. It's not primarily about the manager liking someone personally. It goes deeper than that. Managers are under performance pressure from above. They have visibility targets, team goals, stakeholder expectations. And one of the biggest sources of stress for any manager is the feeling of being caught off guard, not knowing what's happening on their own team, being blindsided in a meeting, being the last to know about a problem. The employees who get favored are often the ones who solve that problem, not by doing better work necessarily, but by making the manager feel more in control. They update frequently. They flag risks early. They frame problems in ways that give the manager something to do. They don't just deliver work. They reduce the manager's anxiety about the work. In organizational psychology, this is sometimes called the anxiety buffer function. And once a manager has identified the employee who fills that role, the trust that follows is almost automatic. The unsettling part? This has almost nothing to do with performance quality. It has everything to do with psychological utility. 3 workplace stories. Story 1, Marcus. Marcus had been on the product team for 3 years. By most objective measures, he was the strongest technical contributor on the team. His code was clean, his analysis was thorough, and he rarely needed to revisit completed work. But Marcus believed in letting the work speak for itself. He didn't send updates unless something changed. He didn't flag risks until they were confirmed. He showed up to one-on-ones with concise, polished status reports. He thought this was professionalism. His manager, David, thought something else. David couldn't tell what Marcus was working on from week to week. In leadership meetings, when Rachel asked about the product roadmap, David found himself summarizing the work of employees who communicated with him more, not because their work was better, but because he actually knew what they were doing. Marcus didn't get passed over because of his performance. He got passed over because David couldn't confidently speak for him in the rooms Marcus never entered. Story 2. Jake. Jake was also on that team. Jake's technical skills were solid, not exceptional, but solid. What Jake understood, almost instinctively, was that his job wasn't just to produce work, it was to produce confidence in his manager. Every Monday morning, Jake sent a short message, 3 bullet points: what he finished last week, what he was working on, and one potential concern, usually minor, always framed with a suggested solution attached. These messages took Jake about 8 minutes to write. David looked forward to them. Over time, something subtle happened. When David thought about his team, Jake's name surfaced naturally, not because David was consciously favoring him, but because Jake gave David the most mental material to work with. David knew Jake's priorities, his thinking process, his risk awareness. In a 6-month performance cycle, David advocated for Jake's promotion. He believed it was a performance call. It was also a communication call, and Jake had been making it for 2 years. Story 3. Sarah. Sarah had watched this dynamic for a long time and assumed it was unfair, which it was, but she'd been treating unfairness as a reason to disengage rather than a system to understand. After her second promotion cycle passed without movement, she started paying closer attention. She noticed that the employees who moved fastest weren't necessarily producing more. They were producing more visibility. They were volunteering for cross-functional projects, not because the work was glamorous, but because it put them in contact with more decision-makers. They were brief and clear in leadership meetings. They made their managers look good in front of their managers. Sarah didn't lower her standards. She didn't become someone she wasn't. She started narrating her work, not performing it, narrating it. Short, structured updates, strategic visibility in the right meetings, connecting her contributions to the outcomes her manager was being evaluated on. Within one cycle, the dynamic shifted. Not because she worked harder, because she made her work legible. The deeper psychology. So what's actually driving this at a psychological level? The first mechanism is identity mirroring. Research in organizational behavior consistently shows that managers develop stronger trust with employees who think and communicate similarly to themselves. This isn't a preference for friends, it's a cognitive efficiency preference. When a manager receives communication that matches their own mental models, their rhythm, their framing, their vocabulary, the brain processes it faster and with less friction. It feels clear, reliable, aligned. When communication comes in differently, more technical, more abstract, more minimalist, the brain has to do more work to interpret it. That extra work registers not as a signal of depth, but as a signal of misalignment. This is why 2 employees doing equally sophisticated work can land so differently with the same manager. One mirrors how the manager thinks, the other doesn't. The manager isn't choosing irrationally. From inside their own cognitive experience, one of these employees simply feels like someone they understand. The second mechanism is the anxiety buffer. Every manager lives with a version of the same fear, being exposed, being the person in the room who doesn't know what's happening on their own team, being blindsided. The employees who manage this anxiety, not by doing more work, but by creating more information flow, become operationally essential. The manager doesn't just like them, the manager needs them. And employees who are operationally needed by their managers are in an entirely different category. They get defended, they get sponsored, they get the benefit of the doubt. The third mechanism is attribution asymmetry, what psychologists call the halo effect. Once a manager has formed a favorable impression of an employee, however that impression was initially created, Subsequent observations get filtered through that impression. The favored employee's success gets attributed to skill. Their failure gets attributed to circumstance. The unfavored employee's success gets attributed to circumstance. Their failure gets attributed to character. This isn't malicious, it's structural. The brain builds a predictive model for each person it regularly encounters, and it defends that model against contradictory evidence. This is why favoritism tends to be self-reinforcing. It doesn't need to keep being earned. Once it forms, it becomes the lens through which everything else is interpreted. Here's the observation that makes most people uncomfortable. Competence in most knowledge work environments is nearly invisible. Think about what a manager can actually observe directly. They can see who speaks up in meetings, who sends updates, who raises concerns early, who seems calm under pressure, who makes them look good in front of their boss. They cannot directly observe the quality of someone's thinking in isolation. They cannot directly observe how much cognitive depth went into a deliverable. They cannot directly observe the hours of careful work that happened with no audience. This means that in most organizations, performance and visibility are being measured simultaneously, and they are not the same thing. And here's the second uncomfortable observation. Favoritism is often not a management failure. For many managers, it's a management strategy. Managers who have a small number of trusted employees have made a rational adaptation to cognitive overload. They cannot monitor everyone equally. They cannot calibrate trust continuously across 15 people. So they build a small inner circle of people they understand, and they allocate most of their attention there. The problem is not that this strategy is irrational. The problem is that organizations pretend it doesn't exist and then wonder why their formal performance systems produce different outcomes than their actual promotion patterns. Practical framework. Understanding the psychology is useful. Having a strategy for navigating it is more useful. Here's practical framework built around the three mechanisms that create manager favoritism. Call it the three-signal framework. Signal 1. Alignment signals. Managers favor employees whose mental model of the work matches their own. You build this by understanding what your manager is being evaluated on, not just what you're being evaluated on. When you communicate, frame your work in terms of the outcomes your manager is accountable for, not your metrics, their metrics. This is not flattery, it is strategic translation. Signal 2. Visibility signals. Visibility is not about talking more in meetings. It is about creating a consistent flow of information that makes your manager feel informed without requiring effort from them. A short weekly update, not a lengthy report, a brief structural summary, does more for perceived reliability than a year of excellent but invisible work. The goal is to make your work legible, not louder, legible. Signal 3. Reliability signals. The anxiety buffer is built through behavioral consistency over time. This means being the person who flags a risk before it becomes a problem, who delivers on small commitments without being followed up, who, under pressure, stays clear and calm. Managers trust predictability, not because they've given up on ambition, because predictability reduces the cognitive cost of managing. None of these signals require you to compromise the quality of your work. They are the layer that makes your work visible to the person who decides what happens to your career. Memorable conclusion. The uncomfortable truth about workplace favoritism is that it's mostly not personal, it's structural. Managers operate in environments with too much information, too little time, and almost no reliable tools for measuring the actual quality of knowledge work. In that environment, they do what every cognitively overloaded human does. They gravitate toward the familiar, the legible, the comfortable. The employees who get favored have learned, consciously or not, to speak the language that reduces that friction. And the employees who don't get favored, often the most capable, the most careful, the most rigorous, have been told, explicitly or implicitly, that the work should speak for itself. The work does not speak for itself. It never has. In organizations where no one teaches people this, the most capable employees spend years producing excellent work and wondering why it isn't translating. And the answer isn't that the organization is broken. The answer is that competence has always needed translation. The employees who get promoted aren't always the best performers. They're the ones who learned how to make their performance visible to the person who controls the room they're not in.